So off we go. This is, I think, our fourth or fifth year of our Bordeaux Fireside Chat. And one thing which has been, I think, common to all of them is Gavin's presence. So we are always delighted and privileged and honored to have Gavin Quinney joining us. For those who, for some bizarre reason, aren't aware of Gavin's presence, persona, and otherwise legendary status, I'll just briefly give a little bit of background. Having successfully sold out of the computer industry in the 90s, he then decided it was a terribly good idea to get involved in wine. So bought the lovely Château Bauduc in Crayon in Entre-deux-Mers, just to the just to the east of Bordeaux in 1999, and has risen to fame and possibly fortune, making some really lovely wines, which you can see at the likes of Gordon Ramsay restaurants, at Rick Stein, Hotel du Vin. He's much beloved by critics as well. Victoria Moore, Oz Clarke, to name but two, are regular fans of his wines. I am myself. I was enjoying them just last month out in Castillon, and will be again in July when I'm on holiday in Bordeaux. So a very accomplished winemaker, celebrating your 25th vintage, I believe. Is that correct, Gavin?
Yeah, we just done. We did the 23 was our 25th harvest, but we arrived in August '99, so we sort of inherited the fruit when we bought the place. So this is our, as the rain comes teeming down, this is our on this lovely May the 1st day. This will be our 25th sort of full season in charge. Yeah, so full vintage. Yeah,
very impressive indeed, and as well as being an accomplished winemaker, which of course gives a pretty significant weight of credibility to Gavin's own thoughts on Bordeaux wines. 25 years of experience making the stuff. He's also been tasting from barrel the Primeur sample since 2000, and has been writing regular vintage reports for Jancis Robinson and Livex, and also has been reviewing the Primeur wines for Harpers Wine Spirit, the UK trade magazine. So Gavin really does bring both the critical expertise, a wealth of experience, many years on the job, and also importantly for the purpose of this call, and at times worrying and disarming degree of honesty when it comes to giving his opinions. But that's really what we wanted you all to feel that you've got this evening, was a sort of an unvarnished opinion based on considerable experience of the 2023 vintage. So we're going to try and keep this to the next 50 minutes or so, so all of us can go off and have our dinners. We'd, as I said, love to take your questions as we go. If you'd rather put things in chat, that's kind of easier. Sometimes I can feed them into the questions I'll be asking, but if you've got a particularly burning question you'd like to ask Gavin, then please unmute yourself and fire away. Good. So, Gavin, I guess, one of the first things we encounter when we are starting to consider the vintage will be the conditions of that year, the weather. Your in-depth weather reports have become essential bedtime reading for anyone with under 10s who can't get their kids to bed. Just read Gavin's weather reports of the vintage, all 1,000 pages of them, and they'll go off, and you will too, within 10 seconds. But no, seriously, we've heard a lot with the 23 vintage. Mildew was the first thing that I remember hearing. So, was this a big problem? And in the broader context of the vintage and the harvest and the season, tell us a bit more about the growing season.
Sure. Yeah. Well, good evening, everybody. Yeah, let's start with mildew. It was a very serious issue for Bordeaux. Bordeaux lost quite a lot of the crop due to mildew, but heavy rain between April and July caused all sorts of problems. Mildew has been an issue. The 18 vintage, the 21 vintage, and last year 23. Yeah, quite a serious problem. More so, I would say, in the south and the east. But yeah, quite a serious issue. Mildew is, without doubt, a serious issue. So quite a small crop overall, where otherwise it would have been a generous crop, I think.
And you'd say that in terms of the the weather generally, would it be an annus horribilis, victory snatched from the jaws of defeat? Clearly wasn't all plain sailing. What were the key factors that probably influenced the style of the wines?
Yeah, I mean, if you escape the mildew, I mean, it's a good vintage. I don't think it's a very good vintage, and certainly you couldn't say it's a great vintage with so many problems that so many producers had. But it's a good vintage. The conditions were pretty good. If you look at my fairly soporific inducing weather report if you search on Jancis Robinson, if you search Bordeaux 2023 or on Livex, you'll get my weather report, and there's rather a lot of detail on there, admittedly. But if you most of the numbers in there, when it comes to say rainfall and temperatures and things like that, are pretty sort of they hit the sort of average. They sort of hit the normal. From a grower's perspective, many of you will remember the 22 vintage and quite a lot of what was talked about that. 22 was very dry and very hot, very dry and very hot summer. As a grower, I much prefer a vintage like 23 because we're not allowed to water the vines. I think everybody knows that, but we're not allowed to irrigate. So water at the right time was pretty critical. And I prefer a vintage like 23 if you can escape the mildew. And I would say we didn't get any mildew, so we were lucky in that respect. We treated it at the right time and managed to escape it. But so the water came down. We had rain, we had nice heat. People will talk about the heat waves. There were 2 heat waves at the end of August and then early September, quite really quite hot periods, which affected the ripeness of the grapes in a positive way. Some rain in September. So overall, dare I say it, and I think again in that weather report, I said I think there's going to be a lot of talk of classique and classic sort of vintage. So quite sort of normal stats, quite a warm vintage, and generally pretty good conditions. If you escape the mildew, pretty good conditions for making good wine.
Thanks, Gavin. So if we've got one thing is talking about the relative or potential quality, potentially the style. You mentioned classic, always slightly gets us a little concerned when we hear that word. But what about quantity as well? What were the yields like ultimately at the end of the season?
Yeah, well, I think the yields are quite indicative, and it's something that I look at in some detail. But it's quite important if you just taking, say, the mildew as one thing. So Castillon, you mentioned you're going to be on holiday in Castillon. So Castillon, for example, had quite a lot of mildew, and their average yield in Castillon was 25 hectolitres a hectare. If you understand what I mean, 25 hectolitres, so 2,500 litres a hectare was their yield. Whereas not far away in Pomerol, it's 45. The prestigious, much more prestigious appellation of Pomerol, it's 45 hectolitres a hectare, which is significant, especially if you're talking about Merlot. Pretty much the same grape varieties. Where in the Medoc, good yields in the appellations of Saint-Estèphe, Pauillac, and Saint-Julien, much higher than 22. So that gives people a chance, I think, to reduce prices. Not that they would want me to say that, but definitely much bigger yields. And many of them did say that if they hadn't green harvested, they would have been looking at 70, 80 hectolitres a hectare. So it was an abundant crop due to good flowering in late May, potentially, abundant crop. And then further south, the complication is it's not so easy to say left and right, because a little further south in Margaux, they had much lower yields. So they were hit with mildew and other things. So if you talking to the producers in, say, the Saint-Julien tasting, and you say, what were your yields? They were pretty much all in the 50s, 50 hectolitres a hectare, 55 hectolitres a hectare, that sort of thing. Whereas in Margaux, at the Margaux tasting, you talk to them, and they were more in the 30s. 1 or 2 exceptions, like Kerwan at 50 and Angleday at 20. So some real extremes. But so yields, and I think tasting the wines, I personally think the yields definitely showed a little bit in the wines, in a positive way. So Saint-Julien, I think, is a good appellation. If you like your Saint-Juliens, As you know, most of the land there is cru Class A level. They were fairly consistent and true to type. Similarly with sort of Santa Steph in terms of volumes, good volumes in Santa Steph, slightly less so, as I've said, in say Margaux. So yields are important. Overall, Bordeaux is producing much less wine. The last 3 vintages have been small vintages, so 20% less the average over the last 3 years than the decade previously, and quite a lot less than the decade before that. So we're making less wine. And last year, mildew was mainly responsible for that.
And thanks, Gavin. I think you sort of touched on it a bit with your mention of Saint Julien and Santa Steph, but 6 months on from the harvest, you've just spent a very, very intense week, and before that, I know you were tasting as well, going through all the barrel samples. So moving on from the harvest, how have the wines evolved? From your initial expectations of what they might taste like, better or worse. What are your thoughts on the wines you've tried so far?
Yeah, I think pretty much all reports are coming through saying it's an uneven vintage. It's very easy to say, you've got to, the great terroirs and the great chateaus made great wine, and then it was much more difficult for others and so on. I think for me, as I say, there aren't that many. There are some really, really good wines, and I think if we were to sort of home in on this, because I think pretty much the trade, the UK trade, are going to focus on the sort of the blue chip and the better wines. I mean, there's without doubt really good small production wines, expensive wines from the Plateau of Pomerol. I don't think all of Pomerol is great, but the Plateau and the very close bits to the Plateau, so the top wines of Pomerol are really good. Saint-Emilion is a much bigger appellation, as we know, and I think you have to be very selective in Saint-Emilion. Very good in the Northern Medoc. I think Santa Steph has a lot to offer, from your top wines like obviously like your Montrose and Coste d'Estanel down to the sort of better values on Primeur, like your Caberns and your Mayonnaise and things like that. Overall, in terms of and Saint Julien, as I mentioned, pretty good quality. I don't think it's I don't think it's at the top level, but there's some very good wines. Overall, the style, there's quite a lot of wines, I would say, that don't quite hit it in the middle palate, which is when you're tasting these wines young, you want the texture and richness in the middle palate. And I found quite a lot of the wines had a bit of a hole there, as I think you probably know what I mean by that, I'm sure. So 1 or 2 I wanted to retaste. And I would say, having tasted over 2 weeks, the weather's been up and down over 2 weeks, the last 2 weeks, and that has had an impact on the samples. And talking to some of the technical directors of proper serious chateaus, or Lenchbage and so on, samples were an issue. It's very complicated. It's hard to get the consistency in the samples, and some I felt were changing, not because they changed the samples, it was just the changing conditions and so on. I think it's quite hard for some of these chateaus, and that's a little bit indicative of the vintage not being quite so solid, quite so reliable, and missing some of the missing some of the key elements when you try these young wines, I think.
I think Neil Martin, in his review, which was published just the other evening, referred to it as the Dalmatian vintage 23, as in, there were spots of extreme quality, but it was definitely not a homogeneous year at all. It was very heterogeneous. So that seems to be borne out by what you're suggesting. We had a comment here from Avery, which I think we might as well address now. He was just asking, can you explain more fully yields, as in how much volume per acre or hectare do you expect? And I think a good one for us all would be to understand what effect does this have on the wine, different yield sizes.
Sure. Okay. So yields, we express in Bordeaux, in France generally, we express in hectolitres per hectare. And obviously it depends on how many vines you have per hectare. So as you know, much of the Northern Medoc is between 8,000 and 10,000 vines a hectare, whereas in Saint-Emilion-Pomerol, you might be looking at 6, 7, 8,000, and then in the Entre-deux-Mers, where Bordeaux generic is made, down to 3,000 vines a hectare. So that will have an impact on the number of grapes that you have, number of bunches that you have per vine, and usually you'd be, if it is probably worth looking at that aforementioned Bordeaux report. And so we've got quite a lot of there's some tables there with the yields per year of all the different appellations, and there's a map and so on and so forth. What you're sort of looking to do, I mean, certainly in the northern Medoc, they would be looking to be making 50 to 55 hectolitres a hectare, which would basically imply that if you're making 50 hectolitres, so 5,000 litres a hectare, you're making half a litre. If you've got 10,000 vines per hectare, you're making half a litre per vine, which is a pretty, not a bad return. Obviously, places like Sauterne, sweet wines, very much smaller. If we remember back to some of the great years, I wasn't here for the 82, but those were made from that was a great vintage made from very high yields. These days, people will be looking at good solid yields between, as I say, 45 and 55. There is a cap. There's a maximum that you can make as well. So, which is sort of in the higher 50s is the cap that you're allowed to make. But really, when you're making 20s and 30s, that's quite, unless you've got particular circumstances which might affect that. 20s and 30s is a low yield, and we saw quite a lot of that in 22 with the drought and the heat. So it does have an impact. And when you have a good flowering and a belle sortie, a good number of bunches and a good flowering, the vine adapts to making good wine with that, with what it's got on the bunches. So, but you don't want to overdo it. So that's why a lot of people green harvested or crop thinned in sort of early July and during Veraison in August. Does that answer the question? I'm not sure.
I think that's excellent. Thank you, Gavin. Again, you've touched on this a little bit, but maybe we can unpack this a bit further. Would you say there's an overall style that characterizes the vintage? And then, of course, the leading question, which everyone loves, which previous vintages or combination of vintages would you compare broadly the 23s to?
Yeah, that's the question that you. I mean, I do ask that. I mean, a lot of people ask that. How do you compare it? I asked that question of Jacques Timpont at Le Pen. I said, this is a fascinating, fantastic wine, blah, blah, blah. Can you compare it to another vintage? And he said, well, I think the 94, which wasn't particularly helpful because I'd not tasted the 94. but 94 wasn't a great vintage, so it was quite good. There's been, I've essentially, if we all sort of consider that, 9, 10, 16. I think 18 to a great extent, 19 certainly, 20, and then the jury's out a little bit. We wait to see how the 22s appear in bottle. I mean, those were the top end vintages. More recently, we've had 17 and 21, which I don't think you'd call top end vintages. And I personally think, and I would disagree with people like James Suckling said recently, and we were quite surprised to when he said it tasted like the 16 and 19, I think he said, which that doesn't correspond with my thoughts at all. So I think generally speaking, I think 23 is between those two levels, if you see what I mean. I don't think it certainly doesn't hit the heights of 60. There are some really, really good wines, and I could see how some vignerons and some chateau owners would say, well, this is up to the standard of the 18 or the 21. But when you talk, I really like talking to technical directors. I like getting the technical directors, and one first growth technical director at a first growth, just to give you a clue, she said she thought the profile was very similar to the 17 of their wine. So which I agreed with. It isn't a 16, it isn't a 22, it isn't. So it is. We'll talk about the market in a second. All the top properties, I would say, produce wines that did sort of have a stamp of the property, the estate, their style of making wine, and so on, and the vintage. And sometimes that's a good thing, and sometimes it's not a good thing. And we could talk about, maybe we should talk about some of the wines that were really, really good, and some of the appellations. But I think you have to pick and choose carefully. I know everyone will say that, but what I have seen as well, I looked for the first time on LiveX, the critics grid, which anyone can access. You just have to put your name and email address in to access the critics grid. And I looked at that and I was going, wow, those are the scores of a great vintage. So I'm not sure I totally agree with all the tasters. Everyone's entitled to their opinion and whatever. And we all know there's been score inflation and so on. But when I looked this morning at those scores, because I didn't really want to be influenced, because I was tasting up until yesterday afternoon, I just thought, well, those are the scores of a great vintage. And I'm afraid to say, I just don't think that is the case. It's not a great vintage. I don't even think it's very good. I think it's very good in parts and good overall. But choose carefully, I would say.
It's as ever, Gavin, your unvarnished opinion is most welcomed, and I know we began this campaign intending to offer a very, very limited subsection of the wines which will be offered on Primeur, and we're intending to do so still, for sure, and possibly even more limited. It has certainly been interesting, and we'll probably come back to this a bit more later, that there has been some very, very enthusiastic coverage of the vintage from some pretty sober and sort of fairly conservative critics. Like I think you've got William Kelly from the Wine Advocate saying the best 23s are just as exciting as the best 22s. Even Neil Martin had here, spots of astounding quality are scattered, blah, blah, blah. Some chateaus pulled out magical wines from their top hat, surpassing the aforementioned years 16, 20, 22. But it certainly does seem, probably more than, certainly more than 22, that this really is a vintage where you have to be very, very selective. And I think that comes across even from enthusiastic critics, that it's by no means a slam dunk in a way which perhaps 22 you could almost pick and choose at random. Would you say that's possibly a fair sort of summation?
Yeah, of course, the two vintages are completely different. So when you taste, when you drink your 22, when you enjoy your 22s, they will be rich and voluptuous and unctuous and quite fat and juicy and so on. So that suits certain properties, and lots of people made really, really good wines in 22. I think it wasn't as easy a vintage as all that. And so as long as you retain the sort of freshness and all the rest of it that people spoke about, that's great. 23 is very different. So I would say we're still at the very beginning of élevage. Really, really important. I was asking questions about how, the élevage is it, and obviously the classics, your Cheval Blancs and Margaux are in 100% new oak, but the élevage going forward, I think in this vintage will be very important. So how gently they handle the élevage. You've then got the fining, the filtration, the bottling. You've got quite a lot to go. And I think it's important with 23 because I don't feel that the structure is there, like in the great vintages. I think for some of them, yes, of course. But the structure, I feel that there's a little bit of lightness of touch. And I think, there's a thin line between the sort of with the texture and the fruit and the tannins and the balance. And, it definitely, I had a new acronym this time, which is, see how it tasted bottle, which SHIT didn't start very well, that particular acronym, but see how it tasted bottle, because I felt that they were sort of borderline, some of these wines, which I don't think will be the sort of wines, by the way, that are offered on Primeur, but I think it's definitely one to totally different style to 22, better than 21, and certainly some lovely wines made in the right spots.
we've sort of largely and typically concentrated on the red wines of the vintage, but it would be remiss of us not to have a little chat about the whites, both dry and sweet. What are your thoughts on these?
Yeah, so a very good dry white vintage. Not overall, really. I mean, I think the critics will have been impressed by the Pesset Léognons, but let's not forget Pesset Léognan Blanc is only just over 200 hectares, so it's quite a small appellation. But lots of really, really good dry whites. Also, Grave beyond, and the Entre de Mer and beyond. For sweet whites, I think it's a really, really good vintage. Delicious. Not totally botrytized, but where it's all sort of totally funky, but utterly delicious wines. And that, by the way, not many people know this, but my theory is very much that with Sauternes, odd vintages this century have all been good. 21 was decimated by frost, but what you still got was very good. There's just very little of it. But so I'm very pleased that 23 has kept up the run rate of great vintages, being the odd years right the way from 01 onwards, including 13, 11, 17, etc. So 23 is a delicious. Whether anyone buys them or not, I don't know, but really delicious wines from Sauternes and Barsac in 23 for sure. And the dry whites, yeah, very good. It's very good. I think people will uniformly say it's a good vintage for dry whites.
Yeah, I think there was an interesting comment again from Neil Martin saying it was unequivocally a great vintage for white Bordeaux, which is encouraging. We do tend to overlook white Bordeaux, especially on Primeur, and perhaps that is because the prices don't necessarily require you to sort of buy on Primeur, given the prices you can pick them up later. Although in some cases that's not true. But I do think that we've got our eye on our usual handful of nice whites, and it'll be certainly interesting to hear towards the end of this session any specific recommendations you have. I know we have a fair amount of the second wine of Smith Oak Lafitte, for example, white from the 2020 vintage now in stock, which is just absolutely superb, and I'm very, very glad we bought it, and very glad we've got it to offer, because it's just one of those wines. It's perfect.
Is that Le Petit Smith Oak Lafitte or Leo?
It's the Petit, because you keep they keep the other one, the Haut, for France, for the French market. So it's a slightly different blend, I believe.
Yeah, it's slightly different. So this year it's slightly different as well. So one has 80% Sauvignon, 20% Semillon. The other is 100%. But Leo is an exclusivity with Duclos, the Negociant. So yeah.
And so,
very good wine, by the way. Yeah.
Thank you. And again, not to be overlooked, everyone on this call. There are some great whites out there, some good Sauternes out there, and if the prices are right, then they are obviously worth a look too. And that does lead us on to the question of pricing, which I think this year especially is critical. And it's been a very interesting start to the campaign, a very early one, the earliest I can remember. Would that be fair to say, Gavin? Can you remember the On Primeur campaign starting earlier than, last week of April?
Yeah, so comparable was, well, of course, we have the tastings later now. The tastings used to be the sort of the main tasting week was the first week of April, and now it's sort of like towards the end of April. The comparable one would be the 2008 Primeurs wines in 2009. Do you remember the first gross just after the tastings suddenly came out with a pretty, if you remember, they were ex Château 100 euros, which I don't think we'll be seeing this time. But they came out quickly. What is different about this one is that people have, like Lascars and so on, have announced quite well in advance that they'd be coming out early. So the announcement that we're coming out early, it's certainly put the roller skates on the whole thinking behind the campaign for sure, which I think is a very positive thing. I think.
I mean, I absolutely agree. A protracted campaign, given the challenging macroeconomic circumstances in which it's being launched would not be beneficial. And it's worth dwelling a little bit on this, because it tends to be an area where people have questions about the pricing, about the wine market generally. There's no denying it's as tough a market now as I can remember, and it's encouraging to see that these early releases, and we've only had two particularly significant ones, which have been Liévin-l'Escasse, which Gavin, you just mentioned, with a 40% decrease on the 22 price, which sounds tremendous, and it's certainly welcomed. But given the price hike of the 22, it was absolutely necessary. We've seen Pontet Canet release yesterday at about a 27% discount on the 22. So, right back approaching 2019 levels. It's an encouraging start. It's an encouraging start. We don't want to get too carried away, but it does seem to be the readjustment the market needed. Gavin, in your various conversations with chateau owners and negociants, is this a trend that we should be hopeful to see continuing throughout the campaign? What are your thoughts on the market generally?
Yeah, I think the people focus quite a lot on the price drop. I would say, well, it depends on how much they put the prices up. So I would, dare I say, again, I'd probably look at the LiveX page that anyone can access. Again, if you put your email in and your name, which shows the release prices ex-London and ex-negociant since the 2018 vintage. So you get any wine that you're interested in, you can get a pretty good view just looking at that page. I'm talking about there's 150 wines or something on that sheet, on that page, and I think that's the crucial thing. To me, I think what was interesting about the l'Escasse announcement, not so much the price drop, but the fact that it was the same price as the 2019. So I think if people are going to obviously Pontet Canet was about 10% more than the 2019 price, but people have been sending me messages today saying, what do you think about Pontet Canet? And I think it's a really, really good wine. And I think, it's been very well received by the critics. I thought it was an excellent wine. And if you like Pontet Canet, I see no reason, not to buy it. I said to people, I don't think you'll see, you won't make a massive profit, you won't make a massive loss. But if you want to buy it, then it's a good buy in the context of recent vintages. I think it's a really, really good wine. I don't always think it's a really good wine, but this year I think it's a very good wine.
And Gavin, I suppose it's a question to ask you. You're talking about if you like this wine, if you think it's good, then buy it. But are you an en primeur buyer yourself? Even now, with many vintages I'm sure in the cellar, are there things that you will consider buying en primeur?
Yeah, I mean, I am an en primeur buyer. I sort of came back more into it with the 2019 vintage because the prices were good and the wines were really good, and I was lucky enough to taste them because I was here. Whereas obviously with the COVID in 2020 it was difficult. So I went in quite heavily. I mean, not at the top end. I can't afford first growth, and I'm not particularly interested in them at those prices. But super seconds downwards. I don't buy super seconds a lot. Stephen Spurrier once told me that when I asked him what he bought, he said, well, he tries to limit it to £500 a case because he doesn't want to have any issues with serving bottles in the future to his friends and not thinking, oh my God, I can't serve this. So most of my stuff has been, I would say, if you like, Domaine du Chevalier, La Gaffalière, that sort of stuff downwards, so that your Felon Segurs and La Font Rochers and your Rougets from Pomerol. So lots of stuff. And I've got a Lango Barton and things like that. So different Granada Cru. I don't know what I'm going to do with it. I've got a stash of all those wines, and I carried on buying them. And I'd buy them again this year, actually. So if the price is right. But I was encouraged by 2019 and less encouraged by 22 for sure. I bought a lot less in 22.
Yeah, I think that the clear message that has been given to the chateaus this year, which hopefully is going to continue to take effect, is that you've got to be more than a great wine. You've certainly got to be more than a good wine. You've got to be more than a great wine. You have to be a great price. People, it's no longer enough to have an excuse to buy. People need a reason to jump in. And I think the price is going to make a considerable difference. I do have one quote here, which I just thought was quite interesting. It's not that it's the counter argument to what we've been saying, but it does perhaps put things in context. And Gavin, you were talking a lot about LiveX, of course. There was an interesting comment here. You'll forgive me. I'll just read it as quickly as I can. Saying, there's rarely been a moment in recent history where commentators have not closely scrutinized Bordeaux prices. Last year, their report suggested that the campaign was offering a little in terms of compelling value. Would we have been happier 15 years earlier? If Robert Parker's 2005 vintage report is to believe, the answer is no. In it, he was similarly unhappy about Bordeaux's astonishing price climbs. That was in 2005. Then he said the picture was no rosier in the 1980s. In 1986, English journalist Oberon Waugh wrote that only the very rich could buy top Bordeaux, compared to 15 years ago when any well-off person could afford to fill his cellar. And then 15 years before that, in an article entirely dedicated to Bordeaux pricing, Terry Robard of the New York Times complained of the seemingly endless escalation of price rises for top Bordeaux. So it's not to suggest for a moment that Bordeaux pricing doesn't need a readjustment, but it's quite interesting that it seems even 40 plus years ago, people were still complaining about the fact that Bordeaux pricing keeps increasing. So I wonder if we're just sort of trapped in our own bubble here, or in fact, this current hopeful trajectory of the prices that we're seeing being released will galvanize more interest in the campaign.
All the chateaux you talk to, I mean, they get a little. Me talking to them about it isn't as important as the big merchants and so on who've made it very clear. I think it's going to be a very difficult campaign, certainly for a lot of the non-blue chip, non-big name stuff. I think a lot of people are going to offer because what needs to happen is these wines need to sell through. There is a lot of pressure on negociants with big allocations to sell these wines. They've got to sell them through. The negociants, many of them are, well, there's a handful that are absolutely solid financially, but there's an awful lot that are that need to sell the wines. They can't just take allocations of the stock and buy the wines if they're not going to sell through. So there is real concern that the prices have to be attractive. Of course, it's a very different kettle of fish when you're talking about Lascaz, the price of Lascaz at well over 100 euros and 66 euros, whatever, for Ponte Cane. The smaller guys who are, I'd say, are going to be of less interest in this en primeur campaign to the merchants. When you're selling it at 15 or 20 euros or a lot less, you can't suddenly drop if you probably haven't put the prices up, so you can't suddenly drop 20%. So I think it's going to be very tough for the sort of middle ranking estates, I would say, and let alone the little guys.
Yeah, it does seem to become ever more stratified for sure. A challenging year for all, and prices are going to be as significant, if not more significant than ever, as to the success of the campaign.
But the really good wines are going to sell. The really good wines are pretty, they're going to sell. I mean, stick your name down for Montrose, Montrose, so I mean, that's going to sell. The top Pomerols, those are going to sell. So I think they'll make gestures. Those are going to sell through because they're great wines, and people love them. They're great brands.
Yeah, I would like to agree. I think they will stand a far greater chance of selling through if the price drops are into the 20-25% or more, closer to 30%, reduction. I think, there have been, Montrose is a case in point, has made stunning wines for the last many vintages. Do people really need another vintage of it unless there is a great price to accompany what is another wine of the vintage for a number of critics? So I think that was to my earlier point about, I think people no longer just need an excuse to buy a great vintage of Bordeaux. They need a reason, and I think this year the price is going to be a very, very compelling feature of whether or not certainly our Honest Grapes club members choose to jump in, and of course whether or not we choose to offer the wines in the first place. Gavin, I'm conscious we've got maybe a few minutes left. I would love to get what I'm going to suggest, a team who are still with us. If you've got any questions for Gavin, now's the time to ask or think about it. Gavin is also very kindly he's compiling his own sort of list of top recommended wines. We're going to put his personal email address in the chat now, so that you will have that and you can email him for his personal recommendations. But maybe you could give us a little sort of a sneak preview of maybe three or four wines in the if money is no object, what would you absolutely buy this year? Number one.
Money no object to be Le Pen, but that's a bit pointless. I would say definitely I would go large on Montrose.
Montrose, yeah.
It's a fantastic wine, and they've been very selective. I think it's easily first growth quality. I don't know why they don't need my help. I mean, I think as well. I think some of the Pomerols are outstanding. So if it's sort of expensive Pomerols, L'Evangile is a beautiful wine. I mean, people can argue about Église Quinney and so on, said La Fleur and all the rest of it. But I thought L'Evangile is a really lovely. I think Juliet's hit full stride with that wine. Really, really good. So I would try and buy some of that. That from the Lafite stable was the one I'd have.
That's very encouraging, and I promise you this wasn't teed up because the Lafite stable are releasing tomorrow, although they are, which will be very exciting, which will include L'Evangile. So watch out for those tomorrow. And then I guess the next category down was your best value option, from the vintage that would be offered on Primeur, something you think we might overlook, that just really was like, wow, I can't believe it's that price, or will be that price.
I there's a lot of, I mentioned earlier Saint-Julien's. If the Saint-Julien's are really attractively priced, so I mean, for example, Clos de Marquis was sort of overlooked in this. I mean, it's not a particularly amazing price, but it's a lovely, lovely wine. I would say if any of you really go for any of the Saint-Julien's, if they're your thing, if you like Saint-Julien's, there weren't any that I sort of marked down particularly. I think there were some surprises. I was really impressed with a number of wines. La Font Rocher is a wine I like, and it's under new ownership, and I was sort of expecting maybe not to be amazed by it, but Christophe Conget, the ex-Lafite guy, I think that was really good quality. It'll be, no one will really shout about it, I don't think, but that was a surprisingly welcome thing, because I've always liked La Font Rocher, and I think I was expecting not to like it quite so much. Brilliant wine. At the value end, Cabane, the wine from Calon-Ségur, is a very popular thing for the UK trade, and I'd definitely buy that. I like Mené. It's a bigger, richer style, but it's great terroir, just around the road from Montrose, as we know, and it's not particularly expensive. So there's enough, there's a selection, but those would be a couple I'd probably go for. There's nothing cheap in Pauillac.
Never is, but although
Biberon maybe from Chambertin family, but no, but yeah.
Auberge Libéral, we've kind of got our eye a little bit on that.
I didn't taste it. I need to go and that's always a charming tasting, but you have to go to the Château for that, and you get to 40 as it is, and Auberge Libéral will be the next lot. So that's she's always very good. She's great to taste with, actually. Claire is a great person, so I do need to do that.
That's been a wine we've supported Honest Grapes not just through on Primeur, but we've always had like the second wine on the sommelier selection list, and it's great to see how it's sort of elevated, I think, in terms of reputation and quality over the years. So we'll look out for that one. We have a question from Bradley here that you can probably see, Gavin. Yeah, the François Michevel wines. What are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on this icon and you know?
No, that's a very
outsider.
good question. That's another one I need to go to. I need to go to Tetra, and in fact, just Monday night I had Roc de Com 14 for dinner. So yeah, that's one I need to go and taste. I'm afraid, so I can't comment on it. Embarrassingly, there's a list of about half a dozen wines, and that you pulled one out there. Sorry, yeah.
You focused specifically on one of the 6 wines you haven't tried, Bradley. shame on you, but no, always fascinating wines, I have to say. And yeah, the Roc de Com. I had a bottle of the 2016 Roc de Com in a restaurant in Stockholm just towards the end of last year, and despite the youth of the vintage, I mean, it was absolutely stupendous. I mean, you can see why this kind of iconoclast of the right bank and the region gets his gets his plaudits. Great. So were there some more questions either in the chat or anyone wanted to just ask anything? Now's the time. Whilst you're thinking about it, I'm going to ask Teresa or James just to put into the chat firstly Gavin's email address so people can get in touch to get his recommendations, and also hopefully buy a few cases of his wonderful wines, which are, despite Brexit, you can buy them direct from the Château and highly recommended. I'll be ploughing into the rosé and white in July when I'm back out at Château Rigaud. We'll also include as well a few links to the wish list, which we have for Bordeaux. It's well worth having a look at that if you haven't already put your choices in. And we're doing a special 2% cashback on the overall on Primeur order that you place, which is a thank you, and that will be used on your drinking wines. So were there any questions, any comments? It's quite quiet this evening. No, I can't see anyone jumping up and down to say anything. Been stunned into silence by the news. Thank you, Red. A good one. Did you taste Le Roc, Gavin?
Yes, I did at the Saint-Emilion. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, it's good. It's good wine. It's good. I mean, it's quite. I think if you like Le Roc, it's worth buying if the price is right. I don't think the price would come down an awful lot. I don't think they'd have much to maneuver. But yeah, good wine. I think Saint-Emilion's Grand Cru Classé level, not the easiest appellation by any means. But yeah, the Roc are rated pretty well. It's good wine.
Thank you, Gavin. Any more comments or questions whilst we've got Gavin for the last couple of minutes?
Speaking of your cashback, we're everything between now and I think the 19th of May. You remember, Tom Gilby
Yes.
and his marathon run. So we're on every bottle sold online. We're contributing to his charity fund, which was for his hospice for his mum. But yeah, so that was an email we sent and actually we got quite a good response.
That's fantastic.
If you use the loyalty code, there's a box in the loyalty code. If you put Tom Gilby wine as your loyalty code, you get a 5% discount, and we're contributing 5% of the value of the order to Tom's charity. So we're
very worthy cause and an amazing endeavor. If you were one of the few people who didn't see it because it's sort of plastered across various media outlets, then Tom ran the marathon, stopping each mile to have a glass of wine and blind taste it. I couldn't quite see from the footage if he swallowed everything or was using a spittoon, but either way, hugely impressive achievement, and has quite rightly garnered a lot of attention for his efforts.
Yeah, and if you have any questions for Tom, I'm having dinner with him on Sunday night. So email me any questions or thoughts, like for example, how come you had 1,500 followers on Instagram in December, and you now have 170,000? I mean, unbelievable.
Will you be running the Bauduc marathon
No.
this year?
No.
Fair enough work to do. Right, everyone, well, I can see everyone needs to head off and have their dinner. Gavin, thank you very much indeed for joining us again this evening. Super to have you, super to have your unvarnished opinions on the vintage. We've put the link in the chat to your email address for people to email you to get top recommendations and buy a few cases from you. Everyone else, thank you very much for joining us. It's a real pleasure. Our next event, which I would encourage you to come along to if you're free, will be a wonderful tasting dinner supper at Tosi on the 15th of May with Pier Filippo Abruzzesi from Val di Cava, which will be truly exceptional. Details of that are now online, and we'll be sending around a reminder in the morning. But once again, thank you for joining us. Please do get in touch about your Bordeaux needs and requirements. Gavin, thank you very much. And everyone have a lovely evening. Thank you and good night.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for attending. Thanks, Tom.
Appreciate that.